Well, I'll just talk louder.
No.
I was father years ago, one Saturday night. There were 4 of us on double dates riding around in Union County. One suggested that we go to Seymore Prater just for fun. Well, that was it, just for fun. We didn't even believe anything, of course. But I was the only lady who had guts enough to go to him and talk with Seymore. I was getting ready to go to a new assignment in a school. I was teaching school. It was in Marshall County. And I asked him, I didn't know what else to ask him. I said, could you tell me something about my future? He said, why, yes, I can, young lady. Real soon you will meet this young man where you are teaching, and he is your future. Well, sure enough, it came to pass.
Okay.
Most everybody here knew Mr. John Davis. Of course, you know Mr. Gladstone. Mr. John told me this himself, and I know what Mr. John said to start embedding things. One day, Miss Gladys was here at the museum, and I asked her to repeat the story. She told me just Mr. John what had happened. They were remodeling a house. They lived out in Murray. The kid bought her a nice diamond ring. She lost the set out of the ring. And so they couldn't find it. And so he went out to Seymore Prater and saw Mr. Seymore and told him that he lost his wife lost set out ring. And I guess he put his hands up over his eyes. And anyway, he says, are you building a house or remodeling a house? He said, yes. So we're remodeling a house. He said, well, you go back there and said, you go out and look at the left side of your doorsteps out there. I said, y'all have swept some sawdust out. He said, go back and look, and you'll find that ring, I think, there in that sawdust. Mr. John said, went back and found the ring.
Anybody else?
I have one.
Jill's got one, yeah.
I have a couple of them that happened to my family, which is why Seymore Prater's kind of been a household word that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. But my mother, who's 94, when she was a young girl, they were farming out at Thaxton, and they'd gotten their crops laid by. And so they took off and went up to her grandmother's up at Rocky Ford in the Philadelphia area, and they spent the week. And while they were gone, there was something happened to their mules. When they got back, well, he went to take care of his mules, and they were gone. And they looked and looked and couldn't find them. And so he hitched up whatever he had left. I guess he was a school teacher as well as a farmer, so he had a little buggy. And he and my mother, who was a child at the time, went to Pontotoc to see Mr. Seymore Prater. And she remembers going up there. I think he maybe had an office.
Yeah, later on he did. He moved to town.
And she said what y'all are saying, that he put his hand up over his eyes and said, I see, Mr. Conley, that your mules are dead. They've both been shot through the middle, and they're in this certain lane at this certain location. And he said, and the reason your mules are dead is because they got in some man's cornfield. And he described the man who shot them, which they could tell by the description who it was. So they went back to this location, and sure enough, the mules were there, and they'd both been shot through the middle. And he had no mules, which was a terrible thing. So he went and borrowed $50 and bought 2 more mules, and that's the end of that story. But my dad, when he was a young man and in school at Thaxton, played basketball, and they had one basketball. And it came up missing when they were going to have a basketball game with a rival nearby. And I think it was Hurricane. If you ever lived at Thaxton in Hurricane, you know that was like a blood battle. But I'm not sure. It could have been Turnpike. I've heard them tell it both ways, so I'm not sure. But he went to Seymore Prater, his little ball team did, and asked him where the basketball was, and he said, "A rival has stolen your basketball, and if you'll go and look at this certain building underneath the steps, you'll find it." And they did, and they played their game then. But that's two stories that happened in our family at Seymore.
I'm John Ray Cobb, and I had heard a story about Seymore. I never did know him, but I worked for a fellow, Mr. Howard Harrod, at a garage here in town, and he told something that's actually supposed to have been the truth. Back in the late 30s or early 40s, I guess it was, we had kind of a rash of mule stealings around this area. And Mr. Holland Kitchens was sheriff at that time. And Mr. Clarence Barkley, several of you folks know Mr. Clarence. And you know Mr. Clarence stuttered real bad. He just couldn't hardly say anything. But anyway, Mr. Kitchens wanted Mr. Barkley to go down to Seymore to see if he couldn't find his mule. Of course, when Mr. Barkley got down there, he told him, you know, described the mule to him, and finally Mr. Prater put his hand over his head like this, and he says, "I can see that mule now." He says, "He's a little mule, and he's got short legs." And Mr. Barkley says, "Any damn fool wouldn't know what the little mule had short legs."
Has anybody else got one? I got a couple that kind of, my cousin was up here in Florida. He had some really good ones. And a couple of these I got out of the journal too. This one is a story out of the journal. It's a Dr. Thomas F. Payne of Nashville story. He says, "When I was 8 years old, our house in Aberdeen caught fire about 11 o'clock on December the 18th of 1925. Most of the contents were saved from the first floor by friends and neighbors who carried the things out of the house. But my father's prized World War I Army Colt revolver was missing from a downstairs closet. A couple of months later, my father asked me if I would like to go to see if we could find his pistol. We ended up at this farmhouse near Pontotoc. Seymore Prater invited us in, and we sat down on the porch. After discussion of weather and crops, my father stated his business. Seymore asked a few questions about the pistol, where it was kept, etc. He sat silently for a few minutes, then he described the man who had taken the pistol. He asked my father did he recognize the man, and my father said he did. We soon departed. On getting back to Aberdeen, my father walked down the street to this man's house, demanded his pistol, and got it back. This is another story out of the journal. Nell Loden of Manhattan. When I was young, my grandfather, who lived in Dorsey, had a gray mule that was one of his most prized possessions. The mule came up missing, and after a thorough search, my grandfather became convinced that someone had stolen the mule. He became obsessed with finding who had stolen his mule. Having heard of Seymore, he went to Pontotoc to ask for help. Seymore told her grandfather his mule had not been stolen. He described the spot where the mule could be found. He mentioned a creek, a certain kind of bridge, a kind of tree, to the point that my grandfather knew the spot he was describing. He went home, and there was his mule in the location described. This was another journal story. A person from a far-off eastern city came, told Seymore his daughter had left home some time before. He sat down, propped his elbows on his knees, hid his face in his hands, and said, "I see." Then he described in detail a restaurant where the girl was working. The father recognized the place described. He later wrote he found his daughter.